Hello everybody, welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. In a most unusual year that is a census year, things are kind of topsy-turvy and Utah needs to be counted. That's the topic of our show today as we round the corner on the census, which has been extended a little bit later in the year so that we can find out who really lives here in Utah and how much influence we will exert across the nation. But let's start with a little bit of background on the census. Here's Derek Dowsett.
Every 10 years, the census is an opportunity to provide population data to the federal government. That data becomes the basis for how services and funding for those services are provided by all levels of government. But in order for the calculations to work, everyone needs to be counted. I'm going to oversimplify this a bit, but imagine trying to cook a meal for a group without knowing how many people you need to prepare a meal for. An accurate count goes a long way towards making sure everyone gets served. Utah is the fastest growing state in the union. An accurate count ensures that infrastructure funding and representation within the state keep up proportionally with that growth. When people don't get counted, they get left out, and it impacts everyone across the state. Here's how that happens. The census provides the baseline data for tracking economic development, calculating financial resources in a community, infrastructure, and what has happened during the past 10 years since the last census. Political representation is also based on census data. Congressional, legislative, and local elected district boundaries are all calculated off of the census and become critical for representation, especially in rural areas where there are less people. Currently, 9% of the state's population is located in a rural area versus 54% a century ago. Population numbers gathered by census data are also used to determine the class of a county. In fact, as Utah continues to grow, counties like Wasatch, Cache, Sanpete, Emery, Utah, and Grand are all looking at a changing class, which can make a big difference in how much state funding is available and even how state law applies to those growing counties. At the national level, the census affects some $900 billion in grants, direct payments, loans, and loan guarantees that are distributed annually to states and individuals. For Utah, that ends up being $5.7 billion, impacting the federal distribution of gas tax, Medicaid, Medicare, and the payment in lieu of taxes on federal lands. This is all calculated from census data. With so much at stake, the 9 to 7 questions for each person staying at your home on April 1st, 2020 isn't intrusive at all. Unfortunately, 2020 hasn't been a typical year, resulting in adjusted timelines for reporting and sending out census takers. Expect a knock on your door in early August if you haven't responded to the census yet. And yes, you can still respond to the census online or by calling now. Currently, Utah is 10th in the nation with a self-response rate of 66% despite COVID-19. The 2020 census is slated to wrap up on October 31st of this year. For the county seat, I'm Derek Dowsett.
Thanks, Derek. We will continue with our conversation, join our guests to discuss the impacts and some of the challenges that are facing this COVID census count year when we come back on the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. Our topic today is the census and what's changed on what had been planned for the year. We're bringing you this broadcast from the headquarters of the Utah Association of Counties in Murray, Utah. Joining us for our conversation is Mallory Bateman, who is the State Data Center Coordinator, and Evan Curtis, who is with the co-chair of the statewide Complete Count Committee. That's a big title. Thank you for joining us. Also online from Cedar City, County Commissioner Mike Blake, who is currently in his patrol car waiting for a suspect to come by. So in the middle of the show, we may have a high-speed pursuit. This will be exciting. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I'd like to start with just saying how messed up did this whole COVID pandemic make this census count?
Oh, I think it's fair to say that this pandemic has messed up just about everything this year in one way or another, and of course the census was not immune to that. Of course, one of the key ways that we have to reach out and talk to people is face-to-face. And that's how we that's how we get our most effective messages out. People trust people when they can talk face-to-face, and so a lot of our plans, and especially for our local partners, were around having these face-to-face interactions, big crowd events in areas where we could set up booths and talk about the census, answer questions, and of course that was immediately wiped off the table. Our last big event was scheduled for March 12th, which was also the same day that the governor came out and said no large crowd events, and so from there it's kind of been an interesting challenge to get the word out.
I can well imagine. So in a typical year, if this had progressed normally, about how many of the contacts that you actually make would have been done in face-to-face interviews? How much did you expect to call with online and mail-ins?
So as far as outreach, I would say probably half and half. Our strategy was to have about half via radio, billboards, television spots, and then the other half was set aside for these person-to-person events. And so we were able, of course, to do a lot of the larger, broader outreach through those efforts, but it was the face-to-face that was hard. But even with the billboards, traffic was down on I-15. So right when all of our billboards were up, traffic was down, which I think also had an impact.
One other thing to consider is the update leave process. So in a lot of our more rural counties, people weren't getting their invitations to respond because they don't have a typical postal address. So I think in at least 9 of our counties, it was almost entirely based on this invitation by someone dropping something at your door. So for those counties, there was no response for the first 2.5 months because they didn't have an ID. They couldn't go in and respond.
Mike, how big a problem is post office boxes as opposed to addresses down in Iron County?
Well, we didn't know about that issue, early on, and all of a sudden we started looking at as we started having returns and looking at our smaller communities, our numbers there were pitiful. And these are communities that are usually pretty well engaged. And so that's when we found out that the census invites were mailed to the post office. They came to a post office box, and the postmasters were just turning around and sending those back as undeliverable because they had a physical address and not a post office box. And so we really tried to get that word out to our smaller communities through a bunch of different avenues, their city councils, their mayors, their chamber of commerce, different organizations within those communities to say, hey, look, you're probably not going to get a census flyer in the mail, and here's how to go and fill your census online. And just looking at some of our numbers, they have come up significantly, but we still have a lot of work to do in those smaller communities. And I think the key now is going to probably be the in-person census takers coming around. We're going to do our best to get that information out, but that really was an unforeseen problem in our smaller communities.
On the Wasatch Front, we think of a census taker, and they got a clipboard, they walk house, interview, house, interview, house, interview. In rural Utah, down the western part of your county, you've got some people that might be 15, 20 miles away from their nearest neighbor. Does that create a challenge?
Oh, that creates a huge challenge. We have an interesting constituent base here in Iron County. The majority of our citizens live on the eastern side of the county along the I-15 corridor. You move 30 miles out into the West Desert, and homes are spread out. It's not uncommon for people to live on 50 acres and have, a dusty dirt road in between homes. So it really is going to take a long time to get to those areas. We have some interesting cultural.
Colorado City? Is that what you're getting at?
Thank you. Thank you so much. With the Colorado City area, we've had a lot of folks from the FLDS space migrate into Iron County. These, in a lot of cases, are people who are wary of the government, who haven't had good experiences or good governmental relationships really their entire lives. And so they're a little bit wary about cooperating with the government and giving personal information to the government.
So there's kind of a tendency, though, to just say, okay, I've got 80% covered on the east side of the county, and maybe half that other I can get easily. Why not just skip the rest? I mean, how much of a difference is it going to make?
Well, it makes a big difference. Every person that's counted, it makes a big difference in our state, and it really comes down to our funding mechanisms in state government and the federal government. There's billions of reasons to want to make sure we're counting everybody, because we receive billions of dollars both in federal funding that come back to the state, but then also our state taxes are distributed largely based on census counts, as well as our gas taxes. And so if you want those taxes to come back to your community, you've got to make sure that we're counting the people where they live. It's also, of course, hugely important for our political representation. We're in an election year. We want to make sure that we're getting these counts correct so that going forward for the next decade, we're fairly represented. And then, of course, for planning and research, making sure that we understand how our community is changing. As the commissioner mentioned, our communities do change over the course of a decade, and we need to understand that so we can know how best to serve our residents.
We're going to be back on the county seat talking about the importance of getting out and participating in the census. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the county seat. We are discussing the census. We have a county commissioner from rural Utah. We have representatives for the state who are actively involved in the count. Evan, you mentioned just before going into the break that there was a big laundry list of things that are affected by a good census count. And you touched on one that I think really needs further discussion, and that is in-state representation in the legislature. How disruptive is that going to be if, where there's already a big growth on the Wasatch Front, how much more impact will a low count mean on keeping fair representation out in the rural parts of the state?
You know, I think it will have a significant impact. Our state has been the fastest growing state in the union this past decade. And so you can imagine as we're growing, centers of population are moving. And so getting that count accurate is going to be very important. Some of these legislative districts have seen tremendous growth. And so you've got one representative representing a whole lot more people than they normally would be. And so if we don't get these counts right, you're going to have, again, unfair representation for the next 10 years.
So, Mike, as a county commissioner in rural Utah, you already feel disadvantaged when the legislature comes around because both houses, your legislative representative covers almost as much real estate as your senator, and you're supposed to have a lot more of them. So are you guys under the gun about what might happen in the future if we don't keep every vote we can represented?
Certainly. We realize the impact of every single vote, whether it's in our representation, locally, whether, there's a possibility down the road of adding another representative on a national level, that all of that information, all of those decisions are based on these census information. So certainly we have real issues in southern Utah that we need fair representation in the legislature, and that this is we only have a chance every 10 years to get an accurate count to where we can have appropriate legislative representation. So that's just one facet of why this is so important, but that is certainly a big one. And we're really lucky here to have great relationships with our legislators. But we have one representative here in Iron County. We have a senator that covers a couple of counties. Areas both in Iron and Washington County, and we have issues that we need fair representation. So that's certainly something that we need to be aware of and work towards.
There's one extra little added challenge in some of our rural communities. Wasatch County was one of the fastest growing counties for the past couple years. Iron County popped up quite a bit. So you've had a lot of growth. So on top of needing to count those existing residents, you've got a whole bunch of new people that maybe you're not as familiar with because you haven't known them as long, they haven't been in the community as long, but you've had growth recently that also needs to be accounted for that can also impact those legislative boundaries.
The census officially is supposed to be a census of where people are on the 1st of April. Mm-hmm. On the 1st of April, we had a mass influx of people who were hiding out from stricter restrictions in the states that they lived. Do they become counted as Utahns during this period of time?
No, they shouldn't be. So it's your regular place of residence. And, in some of our college communities, that's a big deal because the students didn't come back after spring break. So especially in our smaller communities, down at Snow College and up in Logan, you've got big chunks of the population who weren't there. So at least for students, there's some action going on with administrative data to try to figure out where these students live. But people coming into the state shouldn't have been counted here. I read an article about New York City, the fancy rich people in the nice parts of town left, right? Came out here maybe, went to the mountains, and they're not responding. And so that's impacting their community in a completely different way because all the planning had been for, those that are hard to reach, those that typically wouldn't respond. So it's going on all over the United States. That's the one kind of benefit. This isn't just a Utah situation, it is a US situation. So there is a lot of action kind of behind the scenes trying to figure out how to remedy this. But there's gonna be some interesting data.
Okay.
And for those who are living in their vacation home or were as of April 1st, they can still be counted. They should still count that residence as a 0, so we at least know that there's someone that has a home there, but they're not living there full time. And that may actually help us get some better data on where the second homes are as well.
And reduce the need for people out knocking on doors because if they don't know it's a vacation home, they're still going to try to knock on that door and get a response.
Okay. What happens if nobody's home when the census taker comes by, particularly if they're all 15 miles apart? Do they just get skipped or do they come back and try again?
The original plan was to try a couple times to contact. I think it was 3 times. If they don't get you after 3 times, then they would go to a neighbor or the closest and get a proxy count and just be like, how many people live in that house? Who are they and how old are they? I don't know what they're going to do. They keep kind of pushing back when that door knocking is going to start. I looked at the map up in Idaho. They have started the door knocking a little early because, there's a lot of ground to cover. And they were hoping with the online response that would cut down on that follow-up, but we got an unexpected surprise.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back for our final segment of the show. What we want to tackle at this point is your part. The people who are watching this show, what you can do for yourself and for your neighbors to help make this a complete count and have Evan be able to live up to the title of his committee. We'll be right back on the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking about the census today and how important it is, particularly for rural Utah, if they're going to continue to have representation at the state legislature and at the national legislature. One sidebar, either 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we were in a fight with Maryland, I believe it was.
20 years ago, and it was North Carolina.
It was North Carolina, okay. Thank
Military
you. So
installation.
was that really close? I mean, was that a shave by just 100 or a couple of thousand counts?
Yeah, the initial count I think was 800 something, and then after the math was done, it was under 100 people.
So everybody being counted really can make a difference, like in having a 5th congressman from Utah.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, there you go. So if you haven't responded, how can you get involved? We'll start down here. Mallory?
If you do have internet access, my2020census.gov, go fill it out. It'll take you 5 minutes. If you don't, you can call in, and you can also use your paper form if you've got that card on your counter.
What's the number?
I don't know. I'll have to give it to you.
Well, that's all right, because it magically has just appeared on the screen below you. So.
Perfect. Give it a call.
Evan, what's your advice?
You know, get the word out any way you can. The one fortunate thing about this pandemic is it's given us more time. Because they've delayed the deadlines, we have more time. We can try some different things that we've never been able to do. But really, it's just making sure everyone is aware how important it is. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the protests, the primary elections, all these things sucking up...
Don't forget the earthquake.
And the earthquakes. So much going on. It was hard to get the word out as much as we normally would have during a normal census year. And so if you're going to have a county fair, use your county fair. As the kids go back to school, find ways to get the word out to school kids that this is important. Make sure everyone knows that there's still time. They can still participate, and it really does make a difference for their community.
How can constituents of Iron County help the county get this done?
You know, I think the biggest thing is to, you know, with that time that we have, spend, you know, we're gonna make some really big pushes on social media. Evan made a great point with the school kids coming back into session. We do have representatives from the school board, the school district on our complete count committee. We're really going to push that information out, you know, through the kids via social media. Take the time to, when you get that information, act on it. Fill out your information, but I would ask our folks to share that, share those posts. When you do complete your census form, let people know on social media. Encourage your friends and neighbors to do it because it really is important. It needs to be a grassroots movement in rural Utah.
Are we going to be able to accomplish this if we don't like start yakking to our neighbors?
You know, I think it's going to take everyone reaching out. The most trusted voices are the people you know the best. So your neighbors, your local elected officials are going to have the biggest impact.
Excellent. Here's the contact information below once again for you to participate online, and we'll look for you next week on the county seat. Get involved. Go fill out that census form. We'll see you next week. Thank you for watching The County Seat. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications to keep up to date on the program and happenings around Utah.